The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
We are very pleased this week to have Professor Eli Friedman, who is an associate professor of international and comparative labor in our own School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. He's the author of a book titled Insurgency Trap, Labor Politics in Post-Socialist China, and an editor of the book China on Strike, Narratives of Workers' Resistance. The most recent of his many essays is about CCP migrant labor policy as a form of just-in-time urbanization. It's really excellent, I recommend it. He's also an important public intellectual, having written for The Nation, Jacobin, the Financial Times, and a dozen other high-circulation outlets. He's a recipient of the McIntyre Award for Exemplary Teaching at Cornell in the School of Labor Relations, and you can study with him right here if you have the desire to do so, which I suspect you will.
The CCCI is really a great forum. I've got to enjoy it as a listener for the last several years, and it's really a pleasure to be here now as a presenter. Before getting into the material, I also want to give a shout out to the Institute for Social Sciences here at Cornell, which has really played a decisive role in supporting my research, where I'm part of a research group on Chinese cities right now, which is headed by Jeremy Wallace, faculty member in the government department. As you might guess, based on my position in the ILR school, I'm a labor scholar. Going back to 2011, when I first showed up here, I never would have imagined that I'd be writing a book about urbanization, but here I am. And Cornell has been a really wonderful place, both to be a China scholar and to study cities and urbanization. I encourage you all to take advantage of those sorts of resources. So today I'm going to be presenting material from a book that I'm in the process of writing, titled The Urbanization of People. This is a project that looks at how the urban state in China manages flows of people amidst what has been referred to as the largest migration in human history, currently numbering more than 250 million people who are moving largely from rural areas to cities. I'm going to present some of the key arguments from the book, as well as some of the conceptual innovations that I develop, and some of the information on government policy. I have also a lot of data. In fact, the majority of my data is ethnographic and interview data on people's lived experiences, on how sort of state policy and changes in the structure of the economy are experienced sort of within migrant communities in urban China, as well as various sorts of coping mechanisms and forms of social resistance. Unfortunately, all of that really interesting sort of qualitative data is going to be left out of this talk just because of time constraints. Okay, so let's begin in the summer of 2011 in the city of Beijing. A couple weeks before the school semester is going to begin, the city launches an attack on migrant schools. And they demolish a couple dozen schools for the children of migrant workers, leaving tens of thousands of people without a place to go to school shortly before the semester is going to start. And then they leave parents scrambling, trying to find somewhere to put their children into school or sending them back to their hometowns in rural areas. Before proceeding, I've already used a term that I need to define, and that is the migrant school. So what is a migrant school? Migrant schools are institutions in urban areas in China that serve people who have been excluded from the public school system by virtue of their hukou or their household registration system. I'm going to talk a lot more about that and the processes of exclusion. These schools are largely or completely privatized and totally dependent on the tuition of their students. They serve exclusively or almost exclusively non-local students, people who come from outside of the city. As you can see in this photo from one of the schools that I studied in Beijing, they are badly under-resourced, and that's because they are totally privatized, but they serve a market that does not have very much money, so tuition is low, and therefore they don't have resources to provide students with quality education. So when I talk about migrant schools, this is what I'm referring to. Now, in my earlier research on labor conflicts, which was mostly based in Guangdong province, I'd heard a lot about difficulties that migrant parents have in terms of getting access to education for their children. But these school demolitions that I was reading about from the comfort of my office here in Ives Hall seemed really dramatic. And it seemed like, as someone who's interested in the politics of migration, it seems like something I needed to pay attention to. So that winter, I went to Beijing and I began poking around and doing some preliminary research. And over the subsequent years, I've been doing research in sort of a sporadic way, going there in summers and winters and looking into this. And over the next several years, what I found was that the municipal government in Beijing, but in other places as well, was using myriad shifts in bureaucratic arrangements to slowly deprive migrant children of access to education, be it either the formal public schooling or the informal and private versions of schooling, as is the case with these migrant schools. Curiously, it's at precisely the same time, around 2012, 2013, and especially 2014, when the central government begins sort of advancing this slogan, the urbanization of people, which is where I get the title of my book. And for the first time in the history of the People's Republic, they begin talking about actively wanting more people in cities. This idea, the urbanization of people, is also conceptually important for me, because it's not just about moving people to cities. It's an implicit recognition on the part of the state that there's been a disjuncture in the urbanization process. And the disjuncture that I think is really fascinating and generative of much of urban politics is that capital has been largely urbanized. It's an urban-centered economy. That people have been urbanized as workers, but people as full social beings have not yet been urbanized. And that's precisely what this phrase, the urbanization of people, is implicitly acknowledging, right? That human beings have been welcomed into the city as workers, but not as people, and the state now wants to begin to do something about this. So why is the central government now talking about wanting more urbanization when this goes against just about everything that they've done over the previous decades of the People's Republic? Well, they believe that advancing the urbanization of people, will help them in the overriding economic goal that has been established going all the way back to 2003, which is rebalancing the economy. And rebalancing refers to a lot of things. Fundamentally, it refers to increasing domestic consumption, reducing inequality, and thereby reducing reliance on foreign export markets, especially the United States. And it goes without saying that the trade conflict between the United States and China has only intensified that desire. It also refers to other sorts of imbalances, regional inequalities, sort of ecological destruction, things like that. But they think that the urbanization of people is going to be critical to advancing this issue of increasing domestic consumption, which is, as you can see in this chart, a really pressing issue. In the reform era, consumption as a percentage of GDP has fallen pretty dramatically. And if you look at China compared to other East Asian countries at similar levels of development, domestic consumption counts for a much smaller share of total GDP in China than it does in other countries like South Korea or Taiwan or Singapore. So this is seen as a problem for a number of reasons. One, because it's suggestive of high levels of inequality, right? Because most people are not able to consume too much. But I think more of greater concern to the Chinese government, particularly after the financial crisis in 2008, is it suggests dependence on foreign consumers, notably in the United States, and also, of course, in Europe and Japan and other developed countries. So they want to push that line up. They believe that urbanization of people is going to advance that. Because if you look historically, typically urban residents consume more than rural residents. This is sort of intuitive and something that we all know. And so the logic there is, well, if there are more people living in cities, then there's going to be more domestic consumption. In fact, by 2013, 2014, when the government starts using this phrase, the urbanization of people, the shift from an industrialization-led model of development to an urbanization-led model of development was already taking place. So here, if we look at the contribution to GDP of tertiary industry as compared to industry, tertiary industry refers basically to the service sector. You can see as early as, I believe it's 2000, that the tertiary industry overtakes industry in terms of its contribution to GDP, and that divergence sort of only expands over the subsequent 15 years or so. Similarly, if we want to look at a couple of key sort of urban-oriented industries, construction, finance, and real estate, we can see that their contribution to GDP has increased significantly in the reform era, and particularly so after 2008. A number that is frequently cited is that in 2011, more than half of China's population became urban, which means that more than half the population was living in urban areas. It's a number that is frequently cited, but the implications of that for thinking about development and for thinking about urban politics are oftentimes not sort of carefully integrated. Because we know that, again, about a quarter of a billion people are living outside of their places of hukou registration, right? So you have this big swath of the population, many of which are living in cities but have not been fully urbanized. So again, the situation that China encounters in this period of time is that capital has been urbanized, people are urbanized as labor but not as full social beings. In other words, their incorporation into cities is highly segmented, right? So in 2014, the central government comes out with what's referred to as the National New Urbanization Plan, which establishes a set of guidelines for advancing urbanization policy from 2014 until the year 2020. So we're sort of in the middle of that now. And then a few months later, they unveil this residency reform program that some people sort of say, well, is this the end of hukou? Again, this is the first time the central government is actively encouraging people to move to cities in the history of the People's Republic. For a long time, they've been trying to de-incentivize people to move to cities, particularly after 1958. The media, both in China and internationally, begins talking about this increased openness to rural, to these migrants coming in from rural areas. And so it seemed like something was really changing. The problem is it did not comport at all with what I was seeing on the ground in Beijing. And I was in Beijing and seeing all of these efforts that the city government was taking to expel people from the city. So what was going on here? Well, the issue is this. The central government wanted certain kinds of people in certain kinds of cities. And they make this quite explicit. It says quite clearly in the National Urbanization Plan that cities that have an urban population of more than 5 million are to strictly control their population. And the smaller the city, the fewer the restrictions there should be on urbanizing people. So this then leads me to the questions that I really want to address. And these questions are, who gets into which cities and why? And what happens to those people living in the cities where they aren't supposed to be, the people who are going against the sort of the spirit of the plan? In short, how do Chinese megacities manage flows of people? And what are the social consequences? What are the social consequences for the citizenship regime and for inequality? And just to preview my argument, my answer to this first question is that Chinese megacities are pursuing what I refer to as just-in-time urbanization. This is a concept that I develop by drawing an extended analogy with the just-in-time production method that emerged in the Toyota production system in the post-war era in Japan. And I'll sort of draw this all out as we move forward. And this, in answer to the question, what are the social consequences, I say, what we see in China is the emergence of an inverted welfare state, in which the logic of welfare states as they emerged in capitalist countries in the 20th century is perfectly inverted, where public resources are sort of diverted to people who need them the least, which again is an inversion of the logic of the welfare state. As I mentioned at the outset, my book also deals with coping strategies of migrant workers and resistance among both parents and teachers, and I'm not going to be able to deal with that today, but happy to talk about some of that in Q&A. Okay, so how do I go about answering these questions? I'm not going to walk you through my methods too much. I do want to say that I'm focusing on schools. There's a lot of perspectives from which you can study urbanization. I think that schools are an interesting site for understanding this problem of the urbanization of people because it is a key site of social reproduction. And I'm going to be talking about social reproduction. What that term means for me is all of the interventions that are necessary in the maintenance and regeneration of human life at some sort of socially determined level on a daily basis, but also on a generational basis. So these are all of the things that are necessary to allow social life to continue that occur outside of the workplace. And key institutions of social reproduction, of course, are the house, and thinking about domestic labor that's going on there, education, healthcare. These are sort of the main areas of social reproduction. So looking at schools allows me to ask the question, sort of, how are people being incorporated outside of the labor market? And part of this sort of stems from my first project, which was very sort of labor market and workplace focused. And now I want to know what's happening to those folks when they go home at the end of the day. Looking at the schools also allows us to get at intergenerational processes. So we can sort of ask the question, will the children of migrants have similar life chances to urban children? Or might we be seeing a formation of an urban underclass? And we can't say this conclusively, but to some extent, looking at dynamics within the school allows us to anticipate future social dynamics. I conducted 250 interviews and several months of ethnographic observation. Most of the book and most of my presentation today is about the city of Beijing, but I also did research in Guangzhou and Chengdu, and working with Christine Wen, who's a PhD student here in city and regional planning. I've also done some research in Guizhou. Okay, enough on the methods. So you have a sense of the kinds of empirical questions, but how should we go about conceptualizing what's happening here? If we look at the 2011 school demolitions, this looks like a process whereby the urban state is expelling the surplus population. This idea of surplus population has been an increasingly popular framework for understanding processes of urbanization in the global south, where in many cities around the world we see people moving to cities without any promise of sort of gainful employment or of gaining formal housing. They're sort of excluded to the informal economy and living in slums. And this kind of looks like that, right? These are people that the state is saying, you are superfluous and we're going to remove you from the city. But let's dig into this a little bit. I'm going to try to keep this theory as brief as possible, but I do think it's important to have some sort of conceptual framework in hand before we return to the sort of the specifics about what's going on in China. So what is a surplus population? Surplus population, or relative surplus population, is a term developed by Karl Marx. He wrote about this in the first volume of Capital. And for Marx and others more recently, surplus population is defined in its relationship to capital, its value for capital. So a surplus population is a group of people that are, from the perspective of capital, irrelevant, that they're not productive. They play no role in capital accumulation, right? And therefore they are surplus to the needs of capital. That's really what this term refers to. As I said, there's been this a recent revival of interest in surplus populations. A lot of well-known people have used this term or this kind of conceptualization, either explicitly or implicitly, including Mike Davis, Saskia Sasson, others. I think that there's some really major issues with this conceptualization, and I could go on about this, but to keep it very sort of simple and concrete, this just did not align with what I saw empirically. Because when we look at those school demolitions and the people who are being removed from the city of Beijing, actually a lot of them are gainfully employed, right? They're making major economic contributions to the city in various different ways. And in fact, the city could not function without them. And we've actually seen this in successive waves of expulsion that have happened in Beijing in recent years, that actually oftentimes employers, in other words, capitalists, are almost as angry about what's happening as migrants because they are being deprived of their lifeblood. In other words, these people are not surplus. They're not a surplus population by virtue of their position within the structure of the economy. They're being rendered surplus. There's an active role of the state in producing them as a surplus population, which is excluded from urban space, right? Has nothing to do with their relation with their utility from the perspective of capital. So I think that this traditional definition doesn't work. I'm going to have to keep it very succinct here, but I think that Michel Foucault's concept and theorization of biopolitics actually helps me rescue this notion of surplus population. So, biopower. Biopower is a form of power that Foucault identified, that he said emerged in the 18th and to some extent the 19th century. It's a new form of power that is in contrast to earlier forms of power, notably sovereign power, which you don't have to worry about too much. But biopower is the power, the way he defines it succinctly is to make, live, and let die, right? So it's not a form of power that's oriented towards taking away life, which is what sovereign power is, right? As a sovereign, I can go out and I can kill you if I want to, if I'm the king. He says that biopower is oriented towards making live, and that these life-enhancing forms of biopower are directed at a new object, and that new object is called the population. A population is not a sort of a concept that power has in its sort of imagination prior to the 18th century. And the sorts of interventions that are employed by biopower include things like hygiene, health, housing, education. These are things that are made that allow a population to live, to flourish. This raises the question of why do people need to live? Why is this form of power emerging in the 18th and the 19th century? And Foucault, in part because of his sort of methodological orientation, is not going to answer that why question. But if we asked Marx, he would have an answer, or other Marxists, they would have an answer. And the answer would be that this is precisely the time that capitalism is emerging, and that capital requires what Marx would call living labor, right? For Marx, labor is the source of value, and he refers to human beings and active forms of labor as a form of, he refers to human beings and sort of labor power as living labor, right? You need to join capital to labor in order to produce value. Human beings need to be alive. And that living labor needs to be joined to capital in the appropriate qualities and quantities in space and time. They have to be brought together in order for production to happen. And for my purposes, the sort of negotiations over the bringing together of the appropriate qualities and quantities of labor and capital in space and time is the essence of biopolitics. Furthermore, this is not just about making humans live at some sort of bare life level of sort of, they don't just need to be biologically viable. This is the way that a lot of people talk about biopolitics. But I think it's sort of a more Marxian perspective would say that no, people actually have to be alive at some sort of socially determined, viable level of life, some necessary level of competency. So it's not just that you are living, but that you are alive and that you have certain capacities to actively transform the world. Okay. Now, I think that this engagement with Foucault is necessary because a traditional Marxian sort of opposition between the working class and surplus population, this is the way that Marx makes that distinction, right? The working class is exploited, but it's necessary for capital accumulation. You need a working class, right? The surplus population is irrelevant to that whole process of capital accumulation. So I think that that engaging with Foucault helps us sort of overcome some of the problems there. And when we look particularly at cities, the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion within urban space is relatively autonomous from the needs of capital, whatever those might be. This is not just sort of capital needs this or that, and so people get excluded or included. That's not, I think, what I see happening in Beijing at all. So instead, I'm proposing this reconstructed population schema, which is different from both the way Foucault and Marx think about it, but I think is a useful synthesis of the two. And the sort of the axis of differentiation in this schema is not, as Marx would ask, sort of what is their relationship to the means of production, but within a given space, for whom is social reproduction guaranteed? In other words, what is your relationship to the means of social reproduction? All those things that I've talked about, education, health, housing, etc. So for whom is it guaranteed? Who has some sort of provisional access, and for whom is it denied? So in this reconstructed schema, the population is that group for whom social reproduction is relatively guaranteed. It's never 100% guaranteed for anybody, right? But relatively guaranteed. Then we have the provisional population, which is you have sort of revocable or precarious access to social reproduction. This is more or less referring to the migrant workers who have their children in schools, but it's precarious. It can be taken away by the state. And then finally, we have the surplus population, which are those who have no access to social reproduction. So when you think back to those school demolitions that I started at the outset, what's happening here is that the state is taking people who are in this provisional population and they are pushing them into the surplus population, right? The state did that. Capital did not do that. Okay, enough with the theory. But with this framework, I think, in place, I can now return to the original question that I asked, which is how are megacities managing flows of people? Who is urbanized and how? In other words, I'm asking the question now that we have this terminology in place, who gets to be part of that urban population with relatively guaranteed social reproduction? At the most general level, we already know that the central government is interested in having more people in cities beginning in 2014. And they're doing this because they see urbanization as necessary to catalyzing the next phase of development. Now, to understand why the central government is saying this at precisely the same time that migrants are being pushed out of the city, we need to consider this particular city of Beijing within a larger constellation of cities in regions. And this plan, the 2014 urbanization plan, what it does is it delineates different functions for different kind of cities within this urban hierarchy. And I've identified a sort of a fundamental logic undergirding this plan, and I wrote it out just to underline why I think it's important. And I think that the underlying logic is that the plan is oriented towards affecting a correspondence between individual endowments of human capital and that person's location within the urban hierarchy. So to put it another way, we have elite cities, places like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, that are supposed to be reserved for elite talents. And that is the language of the state, elite talents. On the other hand, we have a low-end population, which again is a state term, and the low-end population is supposed to be shunted to low-end places, to small cities and to rural areas. Megacities, these tier 1 cities, need to optimize the population, again this is a state term, optimize the population, in order to enhance their capacity for economic upgrading. So this is bringing in sort of people who will allow them to move to these higher value-added forms of production that they're trying to pursue right now. Included in this optimization of the population, this is not acknowledged anywhere in the plan, but critically is for these cities, they're trying to deal with the problem of a rapidly aging population. There's been a lot of noise recently about how China doesn't have enough people, which is sort of ironic. Anyone who's been paying attention to China from the 1970s until last year, the government has just said we have too many people. China's overrun. Any sort of social problem can be sort of explained with reference to the fact that China has too many people. Last year they said, oh, oops, we don't have enough people. And so they're really freaking out about that. And this problem of aging and China's potential declining population is felt most pressingly in the largest cities for a whole series of reasons, but they're telling people to have more children now in Beijing and Shanghai, again at the same time that they're kicking migrants out. And it turns out that Beijing and Shanghai residents don't want to have more children for all kinds of reasons, but significantly because it's very expensive. So you have this aging population in the cities, and they need to bring in that living labor, that source of vitality, in essence, to serve as an engine for the economy, such that this aging population, and remember, cities are on the hook for pension payments and for healthcare payments. And so as those people get older, they need sort of an active workforce in order to sustain that aging population. And so the optimization of the population is also oriented towards addressing that problem. So I'd like to point out here that the urbanization strategy that the central government is pursuing is not just about exclusion. They still need workers. And this is a pretty different perspective from the way that Chinese cities are often talked about. When you read about forms of exclusion and the hukou, the focus is really on the way people are excluded. And exclusion, of course, is a big part of that, and I've already referenced that. But what the urbanization plan in general is sort of bringing certain kinds of people in and expelling others in a kind of a dynamic manner in response to the perceived or real developmental needs of the city. Now, I use schooling as a lens on the broader sort of process of urbanization that's happening. And so the key empirical question for me is, how do migrants get access to education? And as I've already said, I think that education is critical for understanding these sort of intergenerational processes. So how do migrants get access to education? It's particularly hard in Beijing these days. And now I'm going to sort of answer that question, and in doing so, I'm beginning to delineate the architecture of what I'm calling the inverted welfare state. So imagine you're a migrant parent. You don't have Beijing hukou, but you are living in hukou. You want to get your child into school there. What do you do? Well, the first step is to ask, will you be able to get Beijing hukou or not, right? And hukou, if you have it, guarantees you access to public schools. It doesn't say anything about the quality, and there's sort of variation and the diversity within the public schools for sure. But if you have Beijing hukou, the state is obligated to provide public education. Okay, so how can you go about getting hukou? Well, in recent years, Beijing and other large cities in China have developed what they call point-based hukou admissions, right? Or point-based citizenship, I'm calling it here. These are all relatively new. They were first piloted in Guangdong and have now, the central government has been encouraging all large cities to adopt some version of a point-based scheme, and Beijing has done so recently. The schemes are relatively new, but really what the point-based hukou admission policies do is it's a systematization of an already deeply ingrained political logic that cities have been using to sort the population for a very long time. So I'm going to walk you through sort of how one goes about accumulating points such that you can get local hukou. The most important metric that cities are using is labor market value. So again, these have been promoted by the central government. And so this basic labor market orientation is clearly reflected in the 2014 opinion issued by the State Council, which states that cities should, and I'm quoting, emphasize resolving hukou means giving them hukou, for people who have been in the city for a long time, have strong employability, and can adapt to urban industrial transformation and upgrading and the competitive urban environment. If we look specifically at Beijing's point-based hukou plan, there's a couple of primary considerations that they set at the outset. And one of those primary considerations is, quote, ensuring the human resources to improve the central functions of the capital city, end quote. Okay, so how concretely do you go about accumulating points? Well, the first absolute categorical necessity for every one of these plans is that you have a labor contract, okay? The second way that you accumulate points, and this is true for all cities, is education. Now, they have different ways of counting this. There's different sort of weights in different sorts of cities. Shanghai gives more points for PhDs. Guangzhou gives more points for people with technical skills. But the sort of the consistent logic across them is the higher level of education you have, the more points you are going to accumulate. And in almost every case, unless you have some form of higher education, it's going to be very difficult to accumulate enough points to get local hukou. Some cities issue a list of sort of specific skills that are in need at precisely that time, and it can change sort of year to year. So they can say, well, we have a shortage of, I'm making this up, but welders, and so we're going to give some advantage to people who are welders. And then the following year, things could change. And in general, these point-based citizenship schemes are not open to people who are over the age of 45, with sort of assumption being that if you're over 45, you have sort of fewer years of productivity left fewer years of productivity left in the city. Some places sort of cut off at 45 that you can't apply over 45. Other cities will give you point deductions for every year over 45. So again, labor market value is the most important metric. Another very important metric is owning property. Most cities, including Beijing, will allow you to accumulate points for owning property. In every case, you receive fewer points for renting as opposed to owning. And almost across the board, you receive no points if you're living in informal housing or if you're living in employer-provided dormitories. Contributions to the local tax base or local fiscal capacity more broadly is also a critical metric that they use. And in most cases, they measure this by looking at contributions to the social insurance schemes. Beijing has a hard requirement that you need to have contributed to social insurance schemes within the city of Beijing for 7 years prior before you can be considered for point-based hukou. Other cities will give you more points for the more yuan that you've paid into the social insurance scheme up to some sort of limit. You can also accumulate points in some cities for having paid business taxes or things like that. But in all cases, the more money you've paid in to the local system, the greater the likelihood of accruing points. And then finally, a political correctness. This is sort of a catch-all category that I have for things that are not strictly sort of economic in nature. This mostly refers to things that you can get point deductions for. So if you have any run-ins with the law, legal violations, convictions, things like that, you can be excluded or you can receive point deductions. If you're in violation of birth control policies, in some cases that excludes you altogether or you get point deductions. In some places, if you've participated in so-called illegal political organizations, then you will be banned from applying. Now what I want to show here, we can sort of run through each one of these bullet points, and each one of these metrics serve to exclude the most vulnerable people, to exclude working class people from getting access to hukou and therefore becoming part of the population. If we think about the access to the labor contract, right? This seems like a simple enough thing, a reasonable thing for cities to require people before they become cities. Well, actually the number of migrant workers, this is nationwide, the number of migrant workers who have a labor contract is 35%, right? So you've just eliminated 2/3 of your potential pool, with one stroke of the pen. The number of people with labor contracts has declined. It was 42% in 2009 and has now declined to about 35%, right? And of course, the more vulnerable you are, if you're an informal worker or things like that, you're certainly not going to have a labor contract. It goes without saying that education, this sort of favors people who are already doing relatively well. It will almost certainly eliminate the vast majority of rural people. There's been a lot of discussion of the crisis in rural education in China. A large majority of people who are from rural areas do not complete secondary education, are not going to graduate from high school. And so their likelihood of securing one of these point-based hukous is extremely low. Goes without saying the owning property thing, that advantages rich people, right? If you can buy a house in Beijing or Shanghai, you are, by almost any standard rich. And the sort of discrimination against poor people here is made quite explicit in that you receive fewer points for renting, you receive no points for living in informal housing. Lots of migrant workers are housed in informal housing, as it has been, as I think is widely known. Contributions to local tax base. The social insurance scheme is, lots of migrants would like social insurance, but they don't have it because their employer is unwilling to provide it to them or they're in an informal setting. If only 35% of migrants have labor contracts, it's going to be some fraction of that 35% that actually has social insurance. So again, you've eliminated large swaths of the labor market from getting access to this hukou. In general, what we see is the greater the access someone has to economic capital, cultural capital, and political capital, the greater the likelihood is that they're going to be able to access the nominally public resource of education, right? Everyone else is likely to be excluded. And I should also note that megacities, including Beijing and Shanghai, have even begun to issue green cards, what they call green cards, to so-called global talents. And so they're trying to recruit labor even internationally. So some people probably in this room could show up to Beijing and say, well, I have a PhD from an Ivy League institution in the United States, and you could have better access to social services, including education, than someone who comes from Hebei province, just an hour to the west or so. So there, again, we see here that these hukou schemes are not oriented simply towards excluding the population, but in bringing in certain kinds of people from around the country and even globally, while excluding other sorts of people. Okay, so that's the first step in terms of accessing education. If we get through all of this, you accumulate enough points, you get hukou, your child can get into public school, no problem. The second step, how do people, the tens of millions of people who are living in cities that are never going to get hukou, but still might want to get their child into school, how do they go about that process? And in general, there's a very similar set of requirements that you would see, a very similar set of sort of metrics as these point-based hukou schemes. Some places, in addition to having point-based hukou schemes, now also have point-based school admissions schemes. So if you can't get the hukou, then you can try to accumulate points to try to get your child into public school. And once again, you accumulate points on more or less the same metrics. Beijing does not have point-based school admissions yet. Beijing has something that's called the 5 permits. You have to produce the 5 permits in order to be able to apply to get your child into school. There's no guarantee that you do. And those 5 permits are a labor contract, social insurance, rental lease, hukou, and a totally bizarre form of permit. You have to prove that nobody back in your home village can look after the child. Now, this last permit is particularly vexing. It's logically incoherent. Of course, you can't prove a negative. But practically speaking, what it requires is that the migrant parent go back to their hometown. In some cases, it could be very far away, taking time off from their job in Beijing, buying a train ticket or a bus ticket all the way back home, going to their home village, bribing someone to produce this totally illogical piece of documentation, and then taking it back to Beijing. And then I've already sort of talked about the labor contract, social insurance, et cetera, and who that's likely to exclude. From 2014 on, then, the Beijing city government, or Beijing districts, begin establishing a whole series, dozens of basically arbitrary demands on top of that. In some cases, including that you have paid social insurance in the same district that you live and in the same district that you want to send your child to, or say sort of setting lengths of time that you need to have paid into social insurance. But the clear sort of impetus behind all of this is to make it more difficult for children to get into school. So to recap, we have 2 layers of the sort of sorting mechanisms for parents who are trying to get their children into school. The first question is, will you get hukou? In other words, will you become part of the population? And if not, which most won't, can they get provisional access to school, or what I'm calling, can you become part of the provisional population? And what we see is that the public resource of education goes to people who need it the least, and everyone else is left to the free market. The people who have the least resources to purchase education are the ones who are forced to purchase education. Okay. Now, I've been talking about this in a basically aspatial manner. But we need to grasp a Chinese economic geography to understand the full implications of what I'm calling the inverted welfare state. So we'll remember that the urbanization plan from the central government envisions a correspondence between individuals' levels of human capital and their position in the socio-spatial hierarchy. Well, that's a real problem because the largest cities are the wealthiest cities, right? So here we have GDP per capita and city size. Not surprisingly, the larger the city, the wealthier it is, right? Higher GDP per capita. Now, this is not unique to China. What is unique to China is the capacity to prevent people from moving into the wealthiest cities within a particular place, right? You can imagine in the United States, if you weren't allowed to move from upstate New York to New York City or to Los Angeles or some other wealthy place. So that's an issue. The other issue is that the larger the city, the better the social services, right? And so here we have education spending per capita and city size. And again, the larger the city, the more they're spending on education per capita. And you can see that Beijing sits well above the line, as does Shanghai, which is the dot right next to Beijing. And given this, it's not surprising that most migrants want to go to these extra large cities. So here you can see migrants as a share of the total population and city size. Once again, the larger the city, the larger the share of the migrant population. So the inverted welfare state refers to the system that allows regional forms of inequality to reinforce fiscal inequalities, both within cities and across cities, and that the best resources are reserved for those who are most likely to succeed. So if we think about those school demolitions again, we see that there's an urban government that's trying to prevent population growth, despite strong ongoing motivations on the part of migrants to move to those cities, because that's where the jobs are, that's where, if you want to make money, you're going to go, and that's where the best social services are. I've showed the numbers for education, but spending on health and pensions and housing and these sorts of things are probably follow a very similar sort of pattern. Okay. So how does all of this help us in conceptualizing state strategy during the urbanization process? I'm going to have to keep this pretty succinct here, but what I do is I draw an extended analogy between China's urbanization process and just-in-time production. And the basic argument that I'm making here is that megacities are attempting to treat labor the way that just-in-time production treats auto parts, okay? And that they're attempting to manage the movement of human beings according to just-in-time principles, even if they can't actually accomplish it. And they cannot. It's a utopia, it's a fantasy, but it's one that has pernicious consequences. The idea underlying just-in-time urbanization is to deliver the right labor to the right place at the right time in just the right quantities, okay? And essentially treating labor as if it's any other factor of production that can be sort of moved around at will. So there are three key parallels between just-in-time production and just-in-time urbanization. The first is an orientation to the reduction of waste. This is the central sort of principle of just-in-time production. Waste under just-in-time urbanization refers to moments when people are not useful to the city, right? And the idea, and this is sort of relational, that someone who was not useful yesterday might become useful today, or vice versa. The second is an orientation to reduction of warehousing, and this is a key technique, of course, for reducing waste. In just-in-time production, Toyota sort of looked at what the Fordist model of production was. Fordist model of production, they basically push auto parts through the supply chain, and then the final assembler has these massive warehouses, and when they want to make a car, they go out and they take the parts from the warehouse and then assemble it. And Toyota is saying, well, you're spending a huge amount of money, you're wasting a lot of space and resources maintaining these warehouses. In just-in-time urbanization, the question is, what do you do with those laborers, with the workers, before and after they're useful? And the idea is they want to push the warehousing out of the cities and into the small cities, and out of the large cities and into the small cities and rural areas. And that explains why we see these villages with these peculiar demographic structures of just old people and young people. It's a warehousing function, at least from the perspective of the megacities. And the final point is segmentation. Segmentation was absolutely critical for just-in-time production. Toyota sort of innovated having this core, a relatively strongly protected workforce surrounded by sort of contingent workers that can be sort of disbanded with relatively little friction. And you need this kind of flexibility to be able to respond to market rhythms in this ongoing sort of dynamic way. And so in cities, you have this distinction between citizens and denizen, right? A denizen is someone who can occupy the space of the city, but doesn't have the sort of the rights, the same rights as an urban citizen. Okay. Let's bring it all together now with a final theoretical reconstruction. Bringing this concept of just-in-time urbanization into conversation with the biopolitical population schema that I established at the outset. And what I'm going to do here is look at sort of analogous positions between the factory and the city. The analogy here is between a sort of a factory worker's position in the productive sphere and within the factory, and their access to the wage on the one hand, and on the other hand, between urban residents' position in the reproductive sphere and their access to social services. Okay, so we have here sort of the core members. In the case of just-in-time production, this is a permanent worker, and in the case of the city, this is what I'm referring to as the population. The core member occupies a privileged position and a relatively stable position. We have the marginal members, which for the Toyota production system refers to contingent workers, and in the city refers to the provisional population. This is really where most of the migrants are located. And access here is provisional, it's contingent, it's unstable, and it's an intermediate category to hedge against economic or even political fluctuations, that they can be brought in and then expelled sort of in this ongoing sort of a way. And then finally, we have the excluded members. These are people who are unemployed or fired in the case of the factory, and the surplus population in the case of the city. There are some important differences that I'm not really going to get into, but the sort of the most important difference to note is that human beings are not auto parts, right? And human subjectivity poses a major problem for just-in-time urbanization, because when people move places, they create community, they create bonds to communities and to particular spaces, and they oftentimes demand a say and will fight back, and auto parts don't do that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. So I've argued that the urbanization of people is an official recognition that capital and labor have been urbanized, but that people are not. On the other hand, the state is saying that more people should be urbanized, but they are supposed to be urbanized in specific places. Just-in-time urbanization is a utopian strategy to try to marry appropriate qualities and quantities of labor and capital in space and time. It's a utopian strategy, not meaning that it's good, meaning that it's a fantasy, and it is one that can't be realized, again, because human beings are different than auto parts. The consequences of this are what I'm referring to as the inverted welfare state, which funnels public resources to people who need them least. And working class migrants are largely left to precarious social reproduction. School demolitions are just one sort of spectacular example of that precarity. And I do want to note that there's growing recognition of this problem that I've identified both within the state, but certainly among people themselves, parents and teachers. There are forms of sort of mobilization among teachers and parents against some of the injustices of this system. But it'll take a major political realignment to actually address this problem, because there's going to be fierce resistance from urban residents who themselves are under immense economic pressure and don't necessarily want to allow more people into the urban population, and also from urban governments, the wealthiest of which don't want to share their resources with other places. But I think that if China is going to step back from these kind of self-reinforcing dynamic of widening inequality and political oligarchy, there will need to be some sort of important reconfigurations in terms of the economic geography, in terms of disbanding these state socialist institutions of the hukou. There's probably also going to have to be massive wealth redistribution, which has gotten way out of hand. Unfortunately, to leave you on something of a pessimistic note, I think despite being the most powerful ruler since Mao, Xi Jinping seems to not have the appetite for these political struggles. So I'll leave it at that and welcome your questions. Thank you.